Hey there, you guys. So I got a really interesting comment on our group page about watercolor washes, and I thought it was time to do a video on watercolor washes because I know a lot of you struggle with wet on wet, wet on dry, and wet both sides. So I set up a sample of each, and I'm going to try it with some different brushes just in case. I don't know what you have at home. For colors, we're just going to use a nickel azo, which is kind of a warmer yellow, alizarin crimson. You probably have that ultramarine. I know you all have carmine, lemon. You can pretty much use whatever you want. It's just basically if you're doing skies and landscapes or sunrises, be careful on what you mix together because blue and yellow make green. So you kind of want to have that red, orange, or pink in between the two. And that will help you not get green unless you're going down into like the water. Okay, so first one is just wet on wet. So let's go ahead. I'm just going to use a spray bottle. I've taped this one with just some basic tape. To start wetting, you want to get it decently wet. So I like square brushes for this. This is a really great Princeton square wash brush. And just get enough water on your paper so that it's even. It will dry quickly because both sides aren't wet. So I know one of you was having trouble keeping the paper wet. Now the paper I'm using here is an inexpensive paper. It's actually the Academia 100% cotton. So it's not an expensive paper, but it is 100% cotton. If you're using something that's not 100% cotton for washes, it will give you a little bit of trouble. So just make sure it's wet enough, but the sizing sometimes will bounce the water around. So you definitely want to be generous with your water and see how I'm working it into the paper and just giving it time going up and down because I'm only wetting one side. So I don't have the other side. And you want to work quickly. This is a smaller sheet. So if you're working on a very large sheet, of course, you're going to have to make sure that it's wet, all the way through. And you'll see. So you can see how it's shiny. It's not dripping, but it's shiny. That's about where you need to be. And you're going to notice right away when you grab the ultramarine or your blue, put it in your palette first so that you can disperse it and then just start adding it. You'll see about like that is what you're looking for. So see how easy that wash rains down. You want a little thicker, just keep adding to it and you'll get that beautiful, beautiful wash. Now that's how it should be. I'm going to add some of the alizarin crimson down at the bottom so we can rise up with that pink and get that purple going. This is what it's going to look like. You're going to keep working it back and forth until you get the, the wash you like. Now, with watercolor paper, what happens is if it's 100% cotton, it will keep working. It will keep doing the work for you. So you'll notice a change as the paper dries and it spreads. So even if you notice, there's still some areas that are slightly, they don't look really super smooth, but because the page is wet and my brush holds a decent amount of water and color, I don't have to do a lot of work. Everything is going to straighten out for me. So we're just going to leave this. Another thing also, remember, depending on your paper, if it's starting to pill because you're working it a lot, then, that's just the cheapness of the paper. A more expensive paper, you can get around that. I'm also using a ceramic palette to mix my colors. And the reason why I'm doing that is because it allows me just to get a nice clean amount of color on the brush. If you go right from a pan or from the tube right onto your paper, you might get some streaks, some areas that just are really, really dark compared to like right out of the pan. See how that streaks? If you do that, just brush it out while it's wet. If it's still too dry, if it's getting too dry, you might have to re-wet it. But you can see how shiny this is. That's about the shine we want. We don't want it like shifting so wet that it shifts if I move it. You just want that nice even wash. All right, so that's wet on wet. And that one was using just the ultramarine is what we used here. And I'm keeping an alizarin crimson. I actually didn't end up adding the I got some little things off the bottom of my page here. I didn't end up adding the nickel azo, but we could. I mean, we can still add it in if we want to. I can add that in just like that. As long as the paper is still wet, I can pretty much do whatever I like, and it will really continue to work. Now, I've re-wet it, and you can see how this is really heavy. Now, if my brush is super wet and I leave a puddle on my paper and I don't smooth it out, you can get some backwashes. So watch out for that. If the paper, when you pick it up, if it's starting to slide, then just simply dry your brush off just a bit and then go over it so that you're picking up the excess water. Now, as far as is the paper bubbling, yeah, of course it's bubbling. Here, I'll show you. See how it's starting to lift? It's starting to lift and warp a little bit, but it is taped down, so not too bad. Then you can also take a rag and you can dry off your sides. Even if you catch a little bit of the paper, it's not a big deal because remember, your paper is going to keep working for you as it dries. Okay, so that's a basic wet on wet wash. The next one is wet on dry. So wet on dry takes a little more work. I'm going to use a very big, nice wash brush. This is a 14 Escoda. So dip it into clean water. We're going to grab our carmine, which is already getting wet. I get a lot on my palette over here. Mix it up so it's nice. Wet on dry, so I'm not pre-wetting this page. We're just going to start spreading it. Now, because it's wet on dry, you need a lot of nice water on your brush. And you want to keep going because you don't want to stop. You actually want to keep adding the water. Now, this is good to learn because you're going to see your paper warp because I haven't taped it down. So if you were using a big piece of paper and you were doing wet on dry, then you would need to either tape it down or wet the other side once you start to get up there. Let's rinse this out. We're going to grab some of the, let's see, that was carmine. Rinse this out, grab some of the ultramarine. Beautiful ultramarine here. This one is by White Knights. And I'm going to paint. I love this ultramarine by White Knights. It's really stunning. It's a very pretty color, and it mixes with the carmine so nicely. So bring that down. Rinse my brush out so I can start with just pure ultra up the top. Go over it in my palette. And I'm just smoothing down as I go over. It's getting really wet. Now it's getting really wet because my brush is very wet. So if you want to control that, rinse your brush out and then just dry it on a sheet and then pick up some more color and just kind of go over your wash blending. Because remember, this is wet on dry, so it's going to take a second for the paint and the water to get into the paper. Now, if I want darker results, then grab more paint, work with it, and then just keep adding. And I like to work from top to bottom, you know, or bottom to top. If you see that little splash I got there, so say you get some splashes, that's okay. As long as you fix it while the page is wet, you're all good. So now I rinse my brush out, go get my carmine, my next color, switch it around, and we're going to go up with the carmine so that we can blend and get that nice purple that's that in-between color, you know? That's lovely. Now you can see how sloshy this is because it wasn't pre-wet, so it's a lot harder to control. And I have a very big mop brush. So like before, we're working in layers. Like you can literally remove some color if you think, or remove some water if you think you've gotten it way too wet, because this is pretty wet. I mean, you can see it's starting to curl. It's this paper, although it's a nice paper, it's definitely a cheaper watercolor paper, so it's not going to hold as much as we would like. But I think the key is to get the paint out, put it in a ceramic palette first, or just somewhere where you can work it into the brush, and then just start doing the layers a little bit at a time and be really patient with them, trying not to make your brush too sopping wet, you know? And then when you get to the next color, rinse your brush out, slightly dry it a little bit. And that's this brush. If you had a brush that didn't hold a lot of water, then it would be a little different, you know? This brush holds a lot of water. It's like almost like a squirrel brush. But those are great for washes because you don't want to stop going. You know, you want to keep going. Okay, so you see how it's starting to pool? That means I have a lot of water on my brush. So what do? Just dry it off. And then I just start working it like this. I can always go back and add more. But if I don't want those little wet areas, we do have to remove it down. And that ends up being just a lovely, lovely wash. You know, that's really pretty. So that's how I get washes wet on dry. I find that they are the most difficult to do because of the nature. So going back real quick, we have our wet on wet wash, which is just stunning and so even. We have our wet on dry wash, which is beautiful too, but does have a little more streaky texture to it. And now my favorite one, which is the wet both sides. So you have to work on a surface that literally is like a glass surface. So I have a piece of glass just from, I don't know, it's like an old table glass that I use on top of my surface. But you can also get, you know, a board or anything like that, anything you want. So let's get my flat brush here. And what I'm going to do is I'm basically just working the water into our poor watercolor paper who didn't know this was going to happen today and is like, oh my goodness, this is actually an old piece of paper. Okay, so I have it wet on both sides. That's what it looks like. You can actually, it doesn't even have to be that sopping underneath because you can always, bam, hit it with a little spray. But as long as it's pliable on both sides, it's going to stay the same. See, it's not going to warp. And that's a lot of times you'll see like there's a good watercolor artist that I know, Victoria Proshedko, and she always works like this. She doesn't tape her paper down. And she works on huge sheets. I prefer to work this way actually myself. I think it's really fun. And it's just so much easier because I can like tilt the paper. So now we get to do a really fun wash, right? We can make it as wet as we want. We can grab our lemon. This is like the easiest that I actually do. I'm going to put the lemon here. I'm going to put my phthalo blue. We'll put the phthalo blue up here. How fun. And maybe a little down here. So you can get really sloppy with it, which is hysterical. I think it's so much fun to do this one. Then I got my carmine, which I'm going to set in between my blue. More carmine. Yummy. Look at how cool that is. And you can get really sloppy. You don't have to be crazy clean with this. So there's that. Now, literally, we can let this run together and just let it drain. Now, I went really, really cool. You know, I went really dark because I really wanted to like play and allow this to go crazy. These are my favorite washes to do. Now, as it's running out, you're going to notice it's going to do all kinds of really cool stuff. And you can easily just clean it up on the side because until that water completely drains, it's live. It is live and active and ready to go. You want a little brighter in the center, add a little more of your lemon. Gorgeous. Look at that. How beautiful is that, right? So pretty. So when it's wet like this, it's just, you can see, you can pick it up. You can do anything you want with it. You know, like literally it can just fly off the paper. And then you can just dry the edges, and I'm still, look at how nice. It's not warping, and this is not an expensive piece of paper. I prefer to work this way. I find that I get like the coolest, energetic washes that I never expect, right? And I can even still work with it. Like literally, I'm not limited. I can keep working with this, and I can even spray it, which is really fun, and like just let it kind of push around. Like if we tilt it this way, it's going to run this way. If we want less color, we can wash some of the color out. You can use different spray bottles to get different effects. You can use your pipette, which is your little pipette, to get different effects. If you want these beautiful mixes to go in one direction or the other, say, you'd like it to be kind of at a diagonal, this is the time to do it, just by letting. And I mean, as usual, look at the paper. It's literally hanging in there. It's not warping because we've got both sides wet. And it's not going to, as long as you keep the other side wet while this side is wet, because it's equally wet, right? So does that make sense? If it weren't equally wet, it wouldn't work like that. It would start to bubble on one side, and that's why most of your paper really buckles, is because you just don't wet the back. So you might be afraid when I say in the group, wet the back, and you're like, oh no, I can't do that. But yeah, you can wet the back. It's really, really easy. So again, if you've gotten to this point and you're like, oh, I really would like a little more color. Okay, well, just add that color right back on. And just keep playing with it. Keep tilting it, until you get something that you're like, oh, that's awesome. I love that. You want more color? You can add more color. There's really no limits when you wet both sides. You're going to notice it just makes everything different. But it is a very active environment for you to work in. So it does take some trial and error, and don't be afraid to do weird little things. I actually think the more you hit it with color and texture, the more interesting, I kind of like the really veiny looks. I think they're really cool. And that's where I would leave it. So as far as colors for that was lemon yellow, carmine. That was by White Nights. Phthalo blue is actually by Magello. And the lemon and the carmine were both by, lemon was by Magello. The carmine was by White Nights. And did I use Ultra? I don't think so. I used Phthalo on this one. Pretty, huh? All right, so let's recap. So you can see it's going to just keep drying. And again, if you want to keep it wet, you can spray the back if you don't want it to go anywhere. But it's just going to dry flat now. It's really not, it'll dry equally front and back. I'm just going to leave it right there, and it'll be pretty good. And it's just going to keep working. See, it's still playing around. Things are still happening. And it's lovely. It's like my favorite because I never know what I'm going to get, And that's how I do most of mine. But traditionally, wet on wet is where you guys are at. It's a much different effect, much different look, but definitely the go-to. And wet on dry is the one that's going to be the most streaky and the hardest to control. So if you're doing wet on dry, or you let your paper dry, that's where the most warping will happen and the more streaks will happen. Smoother is wet on wet. And of course, most fun and really, really brilliant, and just slap it on all on there and let it, tilt and play, is the wet both sides. All right, I hope this was helpful. If it was, please don't forget to give me a little thumbs up and let me know. Don't forget, guys, I have watercolor classes for beginners at JacquelineJacks.com, so go and check it out. Happy painting, everyone.